Well, welcome everyone to part 2 of the lecture on visual methods for FMHU5003, qualitative research methods in health. So I'll just share the screen with you now. So, visual methods in health. So now we'll go on to give some examples. I will go on to give some examples that I introduced you to in the first part of the lecture. So now we're going to talk about photo elicitation, photo voice, and drawing as 3 visual methods that we can use. So as you can see there, visual methods can be where you take an image, a photograph, or a drawing and you present it to a participant in one of your research studies, or the participant themselves could provide the image, whether that be a photograph or a drawing, but more likely a photograph. And so the aim of this particular visual method is to elicit a response in the participant from the image. So examples of this kind of visual research is in interviews or focus groups. And it can be things like presenting perhaps in an aged care facility to a group of residents, perhaps in a focus group, maybe images of areas in the aged care facility that might be ideal areas or better areas, such as areas for activities, social activities, physical activities. Could be living areas, accommodation areas, could be dining areas. So this could be perhaps, you know, an ideal image or at least a better image than the facility that perhaps the residents are already in. And the idea in the focus group, if you were doing this, was then to elicit responses from the focus group participants about these images and what they felt about them. Would they prefer them in their aged care facility? If so, why? If not, and all those sorts of things that we like to ask in qualitative interviews. You could also present that information in an individual interview with residents if you wanted to. Of course, the advantage of a focus group, as you now know, or if you've done the focus group module, is that part of a focus group is it's not just a whole bunch of individual interviews together. It's actually also about the interaction between the moderator and the facilitator, the researcher and the participants in the focus groups, but also between the participants themselves, where they may riff off each other, bounce off each other. And this might be a particularly good method if you're using a visual image to elicit a response. So that's photo elicitation. And we'll look at an example of that at the end of this lecture. There's also photo voice. This is where the participant themselves will take a photograph, and in this method, it's more likely to be that we, as researchers, will highlight the participant as authors of the photographs. So in this way, the photographs might form an integral part of individual interviews as well. And in these individual interviews, the participants might talk about the images that they've taken or they've made, how they were taken, why they were taken, and what they were trying to convey with these images with respect to the research study, the research project. And it may be a series of images as well. So I do remember reading a study in America about homeless people, and they gave this group of homeless people cameras and said, go out and take photographs that will give us, the researchers, some idea of what homelessness means to you. So there's that idea of meaning that I mentioned earlier. And I was struck by one young man in particular who went to a beach and took a photograph of a river running out to the sea. And when the interviewers asked him why he took this photograph, he said it was because this photograph gave him a sense of hope and also a sense for the future. So this is one of the interesting uses of visual methods. You know, sometimes people might have meanings, or they might use metaphors or similar things to convey an unexpected or an unlikely meaning. And as you may recall from the first lecture, one of the things about visual methods is that it will provide an insight that perhaps other methods wouldn't. So that's a good example of, in the case of homelessness at least, a sort of an interesting and perhaps unusual example that perhaps wouldn't be arrived at using other methods, perhaps not even interviewing or talking to the young man. So that's photo voice. Now we'll have a look at a bit more detail in example of drawing. So this is one of your readings for this week. So Gearman and Drew, questions of process participant generated visual methodologies. So this is Gearman's work, one of the authors, and she did work with women who were suffering from postnatal depression. And you can see here a couple of images in that study from women who are suffering from or experiencing postnatal depression. So here, this is very much the participants themselves generating the image, in this case, drawing, although remember you can get participants to take photos as well. And in this drawing, the one on the left here of the big eye with the sort of blue center, the woman said that the meaning that she was portraying, or how she felt, and what she couldn't express in words, or would have had difficulty to express in words, was a feeling of no light, of helplessness, and a quote of me looking at black. So you can see there again, that's perhaps a sentiment or an idea that wouldn't have been got at by the researcher any other way. And there's another image on the right-hand side there from another woman in the study, her experience of postnatal depression as well. So you can see there that they portray meanings that perhaps you're not going to get at in other ways, in other methods, other qualitative methods. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at some of these authors' other work. So the other author, Drew, was particularly interested in participant-generated photographic approaches rather than drawing, as the previous author. So you can see a couple of examples of her work there, a couple of studies. So one called Optimizing Pathways, where she explored the development of self-management practices by young people with chronic conditions, such things as asthma, diabetes, cystic fibrosis, and leukemia. She also did another study, Keeping Connected, where she was interested in the relationship for young people between chronic illness and identity development, also social connectivity and educational experiences in relation to their chronic illness and identity. So you can see there for us as qualitative health researchers using these visual methods that we're getting at some of these sociological ideas that we're really interested in as qualitative researchers, identity, of course, the experience of chronic illness, but also things that are more in the social world, social connectivity versus isolation, loneliness, those sorts of things, and also educational experiences. The other author there, Guillermin, you can see she, as we've seen in the previous example, postnatal depression, she's more interested in drawings as a visual methodology, and she's done several studies examining participants' illnesses using this method. The postnatal depression, as we've just had a look at, but also women's experiences of menopause, and also she analysed drawings of heart disease done by middle-aged women who are actually suffering from cardiovascular disease, heart disease. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, there's a couple of authors, some of their other work that you could pursue. So now we're just going to look at one last example in the literature. So this is your other reading for the week. So this is an example of photo elicitation. Although sometimes there's a bit of crossover with these methods, we could perhaps say with the study there might be an element of photo voice in it as well. But this is mainly photo elicitation. Now this is a British study in which the authors did in-depth interviews with 4 British teenage young women, 18-year-olds. And as you can see there on the slide, this was all about these young women's photographs, either photographs that they took themselves, photographs that they displayed in their own bedroom, in their homes, versus other photos of them with family members or by themselves out in other parts of the family home. But also, as you can see there on the slide, photographs that they put on social media, on social networking sites. And this was a study from a phenomenological perspective, and you can read the detail in the paper if you're more interested in that, but you don't need to concern yourself with the detail of that if you don't want to. But the really interesting thing about this study was that the researchers found when they talked to these young women in depth in interviews that what was going on here was once again all around this idea of developing an identity. So it sort of goes back to that exercise that I got you to do, that reflective exercise at the very beginning of the first lecture. I asked you to sort of imagine what images you had in your own mind and how you presented yourself out there to the world. And this is very much the same thing, how these young women presented themselves to the world in the form of social media, but also to the more still private, but perhaps slightly more public family spaces, and then their very private bedroom spaces. And what the researchers found in this visual studies project was that it was all about sort of multiple identities and these young women experimenting with different styles and looks, fashion and art, things connected to music, musical subgenres, all those sorts of things. So this is, I guess, a pretty stereotyped part of teenage years, experimenting with identity. But the authors sort of made a strong link with visual culture as well, and also this idea of the real self versus the ideal self. So the ideal self tended to be those photographs and images that the young woman put on social media sites, but the real self, so, you know, in a way presenting yourself in a certain way, as you can see that example there on the top right, one of the young participants there, how she's portraying herself there, and we could sort of think, we could interpret that and think, what's the meaning that goes with that? But then also these kinds of ideas of ideal selves versus the real self, which sometimes might be the way the young woman looked in some of these family photographs. So it's a very interesting read. I hope you've enjoyed this brief look into visual methods. If you read the Guillermin and Drew paper, you can see they also make quite a few comments about methodological matters, so how you might prepare for a visual study, the kind of procedures that you go through, preparation, thinking about audience and how much you involve the participant in the image production. Do you involve them in selecting images? Do they make the images themselves? And then after presenting the images, the sort of post-study sort of methodological issues, and also some issues around ethics as well. So there's a number of methodological issues here that you might be interested in. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks for listening to this lecture on visual methods and qualitative research.